have to look at all of our practices and all of our structures and all of our procedures to say, hey, in our school system, do all kids really, truly have access to all general education settings? And when we do this, we actually think about the way we see our system. And we use the analogy of a new set of lenses, meaning we used to use an old fashioned set of lenses, and now we're asking people to change their lenses to really see disability in a brand new way, because how we see, think about, write about, and or understand disability impacts deeply how we support, teach, and give access to all students. So take a second and ask yourself, do I agree with that statement? Do I agree that how we think about humans really impacts how we support, teach, and give access to students? And I strongly believe this statement. So let's talk about the lens we use and how we might have to rethink our lens. So this is our first lens. Imagine that you're at the doctor's office and they're putting one of those lenses in front, and you're like, whew, this is one lens to look at and see these characters on the left. And this lens is really looking at the positives, the strengths, the gifts, the talents of these Winnie the Pooh characters. So, Christy, which one of these do you like to look at? Which one do you think is interesting?
Yeah, so it's an interesting thing because I always think about like, how do I see myself? How do other people see me? And then how would I like to see myself? So I'm taking that lens analogy a little bit further, but it's like, how do I see myself? How do others see me? And then how would I like to be seen? How would I like to show up? So I would say, if I start with how do I see myself, um, probably mostly rabbit. If I say how do people see me, it's probably a little bit of a mixture, but maybe a little bit of Eeyore and Piglet. And then if I think about who I want to be, it's probably Pooh,
Yeah, that's really fascinating because you're kind of all over the place.
right?
People probably see you as Rabbit. Um, you would like to be seen as Pooh, and or you see yourself as Rabbit. You'd like to be seen as Pooh, and people often probably see you somewhere else, Eeyore and Piglet. Okay, so take a minute yourself, everyone who's watching, and think about these. What do you notice about these descriptors? Which one of these do you identify with? And of course, essentially, we're talking about the lens that we look through to see our students. Now I'm going to change the lens to a different lens, from positive lens to a negative lens. Same characters.
And
Oh,
now all of a sudden I'm like, but I I am bossy and inflexible. I was gonna say I'm not, but I am. And I would
uh,
say people probably could see me as neurotic and a bit of an energy drain when I bring negative, like all the worry of the world. And then I go, wait, I want to be gluttonous and dull. No, I don't want to be that anymore. So it's interesting because sometimes it's like you still accept that other side of you. We sometimes talk about this, especially in our leadership training, as showing up with more light than dark. But I do show up with sometimes my shadow side or my darkness, but it's not my aspiration. And I certainly don't want others to view me with these words, even when I'm not showing up as my best self.
so we're going to talk about special education for a second, because really special education is designed to figure out just how many standard deviations below the norm is this child on this subtest. And do they qualify for being deviant, deficit enough to have a label? And it is a simply, uh, it's a medical model. What's wrong with this individual and how do we fix it? And Christy and I believe that if you change your lens from the negative focus to the positive one, you're definitely on the right track to look for the light in our students, look for their strengths, their gifts, their talents, their abilities, And we're not going to say that there are not negatives. We don't ignore the fact that some students really struggle, really need different kinds of supports. But when we focus on the positives, we do far more to help them. And I'm going to take it one more lens further to give a real good sense of the medical model of disability, where we think, okay, how many standard deviations are you below the norm? And we medicalize difference. We say, okay, that's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. That's obsessive compulsive disorder. That's a major depressive disorder, right? And then there's Christopher Robin down here who has schizophrenia because he's dreamed up all these characters.
And Julie, people might look at this and say, "Well, we don't give out most of those." That's not the. Keep in mind, we're assigning medical labels to the Winnie the Pooh characters, but in our field of special education, we are still using words that are deficit, delay, disorder oriented, speech and language impairment. We even have conversations around autism or person first or identity first language. And I think, Julie, quite honestly, part of that conversation stems from a negative view of having the label of autism. So we put the person first, meaning the person is more than the label, is better, greater than the sum of the parts. Or some folks have said, no, I'm autistic. It is an attribute or characteristic because I see that and value that in me. It's part of my identity. And I don't see it as something that you need to fix or remediate. So just know that you can see trace elements of the medical model everywhere we turn, especially as Julie mentioned, at eligibility, at qualification for special education services, and the labels that come along with them, whether we're using person first or identity first language.
Yes, and Christy, you started to say that these specific labels aren't the exact labels that we use in school systems, but we have 14 federal categories of disability that we do use on the regular. And so today we're going to talk about, we switch our lens to see disability as part of the individual and not the sum of their parts and an identity. And we're going to show you what that means because I'm going to go all the way back to the idea that if we look at individuals differently, we teach them and support them differently. So on your dashboard, you're also going to have a handout of this, which is called a transition to an equity lens of disability. So we're asking people to change the way they think about disability, to change the way they see disability from a medical lens to an equity lens. And Christy, I'm just going to share how to do that, how to read this, okay?
Okay, good.
So we're going to ask you to go from the or not use any longer the medical lens to the equity lens. So for example, the fourth one down says, disability labels are seen as deficits. And we say, nope, disability is just a natural difference. So you change from our job is to fix the student, remediate them, get them as normal as possible, right? To our job is to provide just right supports when and where students need them.
And then people will often push back on that one and say, but wait, it's not that we want to give out these labels, it's
Right.
the rules and the policies and the form that makes us. Our state requires, our district requires us to assign a label to show that the student qualifies by having a big enough deficit. We say, totally get it, totally understand. But in a medical lens, we would ignore that systemic inequity, that systems level problem, that idea that is perpetuating pathology and impairment, and instead say, you know what, we have to name this inequity and now we have to focus on what we can do differently. Even if I don't have the power to change the eligibility rules yet, I can understand that that label is doing harm to the student and I can aim to change the way I think about, write about, and talk about that student.
So this is a big ask of a system, but it's really what's underneath inclusive education is to change the way we see disability altogether. That's one of the hows of creating inclusive education